Hello, I'm Bill Goodman, Executive Director of Kentucky Humanities. Welcome to the 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online. We're pleased you've taken the time to join us for this special program that brings together authors, readers, and literary enthusiasts from across the country and the Commonwealth, just like we've done for 39 years. The Kentucky Book Festival conversation, focusing on a radical patriot, Frederick Douglass, and his legacy, is sponsored by the University of Kentucky Department of History, and we are appreciative of their support. Let's listen in as Pulitzer Prize winning author and professor at Yale University, David Blight, is joined by University of Kentucky professor and author Amy Murrell Taylor.
Thank you, Bill. I am so honored and happy to be here today with David Blight. David, welcome to the Kentucky Book Festival.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to the Book Festival for having both of us. This is a thrill to be here with you, and I hope we even get to say a few things about your great book, which won the Frederick Douglass Prize.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say about Frederick Douglass himself, so we'll see if we get there. But I wish I could also say welcome to Kentucky, and we could share some hospitality, bluegrass hospitality with you. Bourbon.
Me too. I love coming to Lexington and Louisville and everywhere in between. But anyway, here we are.
And here we are. So we'll just get down to business. How about that?
That's fine.
Your biography is, I thought it was just beautiful and profound and a real page turner. And this was after years of reading some of Douglass's own writing about himself. So to those listening out there, I can't really recommend this book more highly. Douglass, of course, lived a truly extraordinary life. And I'm sure most people listening know he was born a slave and became an abolitionist and an orator and a writer and a journalist and an activist and a government bureaucrat and a diplomat. And the list goes on and on. Husband, father, grandfather. But I want to begin with something I've been curious about, and that is your long history with Frederick Douglass. And it was back in graduate school for me in the early 90s when I read your book that you published in 1989, Frederick Douglass's Civil War. It was a staple for all of us studying the history of the Civil War era, this book about the impact of that era on Douglass's life and thought. And then I have my students every year read a book you edited, his narrative in the life of Frederick Douglass. Every year, it's on the syllabus for my introductory US history students. So now 30 years later, you have published a full-fledged biography of Douglass.
Yeah.
And what is it that keeps you coming back? Or maybe you never left, maybe you've been with him this whole time. But what is it about this man and his life that has kept you writing about him for so long?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for teaching these books. I think I owe you. You and somebody kept that first book of mine in print, I think. Well, listen, I don't believe I learned anything about Douglass in high school, and if anything, only a tiny bit in college, because I did take the first ever Black history course taught at Michigan State in about 1969. But it was when I was a high school teacher that, and this was for 7 years in the 1970s in my hometown of Flint, Michigan, where I first, I think, really encountered Douglass. We were all trying to create something called Black history, mostly without knowing what we were doing. And I actually still have a poster up here in my apartment, which is in one of those old classroom posters that the Scholastic Company or somebody sold. And I love it because it has his wrong birthday and they even gave him a wrong middle name. So it's really a collector's item.
Wow.
But my interest started there, but it was really in graduate school. I went to graduate school to study the Civil War period, Reconstruction, slavery, and I particularly wanted to work on abolitionism. And I quickly moved toward Black abolitionism. And in those days, at least, if you wanted to work on Black abolitionists, you landed on Douglass because he left by far the most sources and material to work with. So yes, I wrote my dissertation on Douglass. It became that first book. I edited editions of his first two autobiographies. I wrote other things. And Douglass was some piece, at least, of every other book I've ever done. I mean, he's there somehow. You use him, you use his language. But I had Douglass completely out of my life. I had no intention of doing a full life of Douglass. That was far too daunting to me. Until I encountered, now more than 14 years ago, a private collection of Douglass manuscripts owned by a man named Walter Evans in Savannah, Georgia. One thing led to another. I met Walter when I went there to give a lecture to middle and high school teachers on Douglass's narrative, because they were teaching it, which I love doing. And I met Walter that day. He took me to his house. He showed me portions of his Douglass manuscript collection. I did not decide overnight by any means. This was not some road to Damascus, stroke. It took months actually for me to commit. But that collection is the reason I wrote this new biography. And I spent, I don't know, at least 6 Yale spring breaks down there in Savannah and many other weeks along the way. Walter and his wife, Linda, became dear friends. They became my patrons in a sense. And the book is indeed dedicated to them. Because that collection, as you know from reading the book, made possible understanding, especially the older Douglass, the last third of his life. He lives all the way to 1895. That collection made possible understanding that part of Douglass's life as never before. And I can happily report as well that just as of this summer, finally, after years of negotiation, Walter sold his Douglass collection to the Beinecke Library at Yale, and it is now almost completely digitized and will soon be available to the rest of the world. So it is that collection that made me come back to Douglass. And then the book took a good decade to research, to conceive, to write, to get confused about, and then finally finish somehow.
Like, I can understand that. I mean, you experienced the thing that all historians dream about. I mean, we all dream that there's going to be this stash of records out there that unlock the secrets of the past.
Blind, crazy good luck. It's supposed to happen once in a while, right? It did happen to me.
But it doesn't happen often. It's pretty
No, it doesn't. And I was in the right place at the right time. Well, Walter, being Walter Evans, he had read my first book. He really knows his Douglass material. And he initiated I knew nothing about that collection. In fact, hardly anyone did. I was not the first to ever see this collection, but I was the first to use it. Now there are a number of other Douglass scholars who have gone to Savannah and gone through Walter's initiations and worked at his dining room table, which is where I worked for weeks on end. It's the greatest archive I've ever worked in a sense, because not only is this man a great collector of African-American rare books and manuscripts, but he's an even more important collector of African-American art. His house is literally full of masterpieces of African-American art. And some of his art collection is now the basis of a major exhibit at the Savannah School of Art and Design Museum in Savannah.
Wow. Well, I guess I'll live vicariously through you. I mean, that's just an incredible.
That may happen to you yet. You never know. Sometimes you sit in it's like sitting in an archive long enough. Sometimes the curators there take mercy on you and they show you something new.
Yeah. But this book, I mean, this is more than just you coming across this new collection and then writing it up. I mean, this was just a piece of a bigger story, and you had to really bring it all together here. And I was struck by one thing you said at the outset, that you described this as a biography of a voice.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Well, thank you for that question, because it was so important in how I structured the book. At one point, I even wanted to use that as a title for the book. But as you might guess, from your experience, my editor said, no. He said, no. That'll sound too literary and so forth. And he was probably right.
Uh-huh.
But a biography of Frederick Douglass is ultimately a study of his words, his voice, his oratorical voice, and his written voice. He produced millions of words. This former slave who spends the first 20 years of his life in slavery, nevertheless gained literacy and then practiced it and practiced it. First as an orator, the writing came later, but he produced eventually millions of words, 1,200 pages of autobiography in 3 different versions, hundreds and hundreds of the shorter form political editorials that he did in his newspapers. As you said at the outset, he became a great journalist, a great anti-slavery journalist. He wrote one novella. Would that he had tried fiction more. Although lots of people who study his autobiographies think he wrote some pretty good fiction, and they're right. But then there are the thousands of speeches. And by the way, every major Douglass speech that people may encounter, whether it's the 4th of July speech or the Freedmen's Memorial speech or the Lessons of the Hour speech on lynching, Self-Made Man speech, and many in between, all exist in a text. This man wrote out his speeches. Before the war, mostly in hand. After the war, largely in typescript. So this was not just somebody who walked into halls and blew out the lights, off the top of his head, although he could do that. He scripted them. He wrote them. He was a writer. So Biography of a Voice comes from the fact that not only that he became so prolific in these various genres, but language and words were really the only power he ever had, the only real weapon he ever had. He never held elective office. He did hold 3 significant federal appointments later in life, which are very important in his life. But he never held, a political position of power. His power was with his voice and his pen, and he said that himself many, many times. So if you deal with Douglass, you're dealing with the words, and he was a genius with not only just language per se, but I call him in the book the prose poet of American democracy. And indeed, if you're looking for a voice that captured, everything from the meanings of slavery, both physical and mental, the coming of the Civil War, the meaning of the war, the meaning of emancipation, which you've studied so well, the struggles of Reconstruction, and on and on and on. What does race actually mean? I mean, which is the centerpiece problem of 19th century America, if not now as well. There's no better voice than Douglass to go to try to understand all of those. And he had this ability very often to capture in a metaphor what people were going through, what an event meant, whether that event was a victory or a catastrophe. He had a voice in some ways like no other. In fact, again, this is in the book, it became by the latter part of his life a kind of an American thing, or almost an American wonder to see and hear Douglass. He was a ubiquitous, itinerant lecturer, and I speculate in the book that more people may have heard him speak than any other American of the 19th century. And there's all kinds of press reports. This is part of what I got out of that Evans collection, of people describing, the first time they saw Douglass, this first time they heard Douglass, and it became an American thing to go see Douglass, go hear Douglass.
Although interestingly, I mean, he traveled the world too. And I think you write about before the Civil War, his tours in England and Scotland. And, a lot of people were coming out to see him outside of the United States.
Oh, indeed. In fact, that early tour in his life, when he's only 27 years old, he had just published The Narrative, 1845. He stays in the British Isles about 19 months, Ireland, Scotland, and England. And it was a tremendous pivot in his life, a tremendous turning point. He flowered there. he had never been treated so warmly in public and private. He made many, many close friendships, some of which became lifetime friendships among the Scottish and British and Irish reform communities. And he had an audience the rest of his life in Britain. And some of that audience remained fundraisers for his newspaper, and for that matter, for his family life. He needed patrons, because one thing that back to the voice business here, from the day Frederick Douglass entered the lecture circuit in the fall of 1841, when he's 23 years old, all the way to 1877, excuse me, when he got a federal appointment from Rutherford Hayes, President Hayes, as the Marshal of the District of Columbia. Douglass never made a dime in his life in all of those years, except by his voice and his pen. And that is not much of an upwardly mobile life. He needed help at times from friends and patrons and so forth. The newspaper always teetered on the brink of failure. That needed help. He eventually can manage to get $100 to $150 a pop for these endless lectures. But he was a person who simply made a life out of words, out of the voice. And that's the rarest of things still. You know, I mean, we have tenured academic jobs, thank God, especially right now. But that independent writer voice out there, there's still a very rare, tiny group in our society. That's what Douglass was.
Especially for somebody coming out of slavery. I mean, that's the incredible
no education
about it. But you know, he wrote so much, as you say, and I'm thinking of the 3 autobiographies in particular. He crafted a story of his life.
Oh yeah, over and over and over.
Over and over. And I was actually struck by the way he keeps revisiting it throughout his life. You know, he doesn't just do it and leave it behind. I mean, he keeps recrafting it. But you know, as a historian, we want the words of our subjects. We're always searching for them, particularly in African-American history. We're always searching for the words of our subjects.
Yeah, there never seemed to be enough.
There never seems to be enough. But I actually wonder if you had too many in this case, because he was crafting a very different story of his life. And he believed in the power of his life story, as you say.
Yeah.
And you've got to intervene in that. And I think you've told a different story of him than he told himself. And
I'm glad you say that, because I sure tried.
Okay.
No, I love that question, because, you know, when you work on Douglass, anybody who writes 1,200 pages of autobiography 3 times over and never seems to stop doing it, the autobiographies obviously become a source, a tremendous source, and they are very revealing of some aspects of his life, especially his slave life. But the autobiographies are also your subject. You have to keep explaining, why does he keep doing this? Why does he keep writing this? And what is it that he's hiding? What is he not talking about? And that category is vast.
Yeah.
Especially the realm of his private life, his 2 marriages, his children, 4 surviving adult children with whom he had very rich, loving but complicated relationships. There are the friendships, there are other relationships, including with women. He just tells us almost nothing about that. In 1,200 pages, there is 1 mention of his first wife, Anna Murray Douglass, his wife of 44 years. 1 mention, and she's called my wife. She's not even named. And that's in the 3rd autobiography. And you just want to shake him and say, come on, Mr. D. Now, one thing that's important to note is that any kind of tell-all autobiography just wasn't the way of the 19th century. They didn't do that. On the other hand, you have to get at those aspects of his life, family, friendships, relationships, marriages, by other means. And those other means do exist. They're not always easy.
Yeah, I have to ask you a little bit more about Anna and his private life. I mean, this was actually really compelling to me, and I absorbed so much about Douglass as a father and a grandfather, and somewhat as a husband too, that I didn't know before. But about Anna, you say she was a good deal more than what we think we know, and far more than her husband ever told us, which I thought was just a really striking sentence here.
Yeah.
You do try to get to know her. And I think that you honor her in certain ways, even with the little bit that you have. I mean, at one point you point out, she held that family together,
Oh, yeah.
and how important that was at a time when they're facing so many external threats, racism, and that was a real accomplishment on her part. So I have to compliment you on, finding a way to honor her when he gave you so little.
Well,
But but what else was it? I mean, did she not fit the story he wanted to tell?
no, she didn't. The autobiographies are ultimately about one main character. Guess who?
Yeah.
uh, Frederick Douglass. And it is in his autobiographies, as one of my favorite literary critics, Bob Steptoe, once said, they are ascension narratives, ascension stories. It's the rise of this former slave to man of letters, to intellectual, to thinker, to creative man. And the only thing that really gets in the story is that which supports that story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can wish in the 21st century that he had stopped once in a while, at least, and said, and oh my goodness, my wife Anna was holding together my family back home, and pick a year. I mean, it could have been in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. He never stops to even reflect for a moment what the war might have done to Anna. I mean, his whole family went to war. Two of his sons he recruits into the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. The third son, basically recruited by his father, goes as a recruiter of black troops to the Mississippi Valley. And his daughter, Rosetta, their oldest, married a black soldier. And it became, frankly, a very bad marriage over time. So the whole family goes to war. He never stopped once to say, this was tough on Anna. I mean, at least a sentence, for God's sake. He doesn't even do that. And it's more than frustrating. It makes you want to judge him as a bit more than self-centered. However, again, that's the genre of autobiography. But getting at Anna, and you're way too kind, Amy, but there's nothing I'm more grateful for than when someone says that, and people have at times, that I managed to make Anna real. And so has Lee Falk, by the way, in her book, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. In fact, Lee and I collaborated on a lot of sources. In fact, she was just a guest in my seminar yesterday about the life and writings of Douglass on Zoom, of course. But Anna is very difficult to reach because Anna remained a non-reader, non-writer all of her life. Everybody has, people like to have theories about why that's true, but truth is nobody knows for sure. They hired tutors. Rosetta tutored her, their daughter. Others tutored her. She never learned to read or write. But as you say, she not only held together this home, she made this home. Whether that home was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Lynn, Massachusetts, Rochester, New York, Washington, D.C., she went through lots of big moves. What we do know about Anna, we learn in great part from three precious narratives written by three of the children, adult children. One by Rosetta, the daughter, which is public. That has been public for years. She wrote it after both of her parents were dead. It's called My Mother as I Recall Her, and it really is quite revealing about Anna's personality and how she ran the home from a daughter's perspective. It's really quite interesting. But two of the sons also wrote short narratives about their parents. And that's one of the things that makes this Walter Evans collection such a treasure, because they exist in that collection. It's the only place they exist. These are both handwritten narratives. One is about 15 pages. The other maybe 10 or 12. One's by Frederick Jr., one's by Charles Douglas. One is entitled uh, um, "The Home Life." The home life of Frederick Douglass, which means the family. But both of those narratives, too, have a lot to say about their mother, her character. And what we learn from these collected narratives, plus from other letters where people will have an aside about Anna, is number one, she did not like social occasions. She never traveled with Douglass. She did not like social occasions, even in her own home. She had enormous rectitude. She ran her house. She did not allow booze in her house. In Rochester, she created a huge garden, a huge orchard, which were known as, Anna's orchards. This is a woman who knew how to provide. And she's providing for this growing family, and eventually 21 grandchildren on top of the children. She learned to do that in part because Douglass was 50% of their life at least gone. He's on the road. That's where he makes his history. And she did not, as best we can tell, really share his intellectual life, his intellectual world. We don't know what their pillow talk was about, except she just was not part of that universe. And a lot of 20th and 21st century people just have to stop, if they care about this, and realize this is the 19th century. And in a sense, there's often, when you get into discussions about Anna Douglass in the universe of Frederick Douglass, there's sometimes this tendency for people to say, oh, poor Anna, poor Anna. Yes, she had her burdens, and eventually she had a lot of illnesses. But she could easily have considered herself a big success. She built this home. She raised 5 children. The 5th one, her own namesake, Annie, dies at 11 years old, which must have been the most devastating thing of her life. And she was married to this amazing man. I mean, there may have been times when she might have wished she'd just married a good farmer, who wanted to chop wood, than this guy who's always traveling around the world trying to make history. She couldn't control that, but she's not necessarily somebody we should lament about, even though her internal family life was not easy. And part of that was because there were a lot of other women in Douglass's life. And I mean that mostly in terms of friendships, intellectual companionships, but at least in one case, probably more than that.
Yeah, there are a number of women in the book, and they had some unusual living arrangements with some of the women who came to visit, and you can only speculate on what was the real relationship among all of them, but you do get a sense of sort of the emotional world that he lived in. All of these people are providing him with this emotional support, and I found that striking. Getting back to the private Frederick Douglass, which is what you really bring out in your story. I mean, you've depicted him as, yes, he's very extraordinary, but it's also a very humane portrait of somebody whose work took a toll on him. I mean, he struggled emotionally and even psychologically, as you say, and some of the depth of that, I was actually a little bit surprised. Maybe it's because we have, this sort of larger than life image of Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, he's the textbook image on these pins we wear,
Yes.
And he was photographed 160 some odd times, and he
most photographed American, you say.
Yes. And, that Douglass is to be admired, right? But he was deeply human, and I speculate. It's a speculation. You can't prove clinical breakdown. But in the early 1850s, I'm convinced he had a genuine emotional falling apart. We've all had evidence of him being bedridden, of feeling paralysis in his limbs, of not being able to meet the bell, so to speak, and edit his newspaper that week or another week or for a whole month at a time, which he himself admits in the newspaper. This was a moment in his life. Let's just realize he's in his 30s. He's got this growing brood of a family with 5 kids. He can barely put food on the table, make ends meet. And he gets bailed out when his good friend Julia Griffiths comes from England, moves in with them, stays for 6 years, and becomes his assistant editor on the paper, his fundraiser. And Julia even purchased the mortgage on the Douglass house so he could keep it. But he felt he was the self-made man, if you like, which is what I argue in the book, who couldn't even provide. And look, it's 1851, 52. The idea of a radical abolitionist at that moment, I mean, even believing you would live to see slavery someday end, was utterly audacious. And the country is beginning to come apart. The fugitive slave crisis is all over the place. They're rescuing fugitive slaves. There's violent resistance to slave catchers. The political party system in the country is beginning to fray and fall apart. And he has a horrible breakup with his, what he once called his anti-slavery church, the Garrisonian abolitionists, and William Lloyd Garrison himself, who had been Douglass's mentor and more. That terrible breakup they had in the early 1850s took a toll on him. Then later in life, and there are other times along the way too, like during the war. But when Anna died in 1882, after some pretty serious illnesses and strokes and all the rest, and his big extended family by then was essentially all financially dependent on him. Except his oldest son, Lewis, who actually never had children because of his wounds in the Civil War. But anyway, here's Douglass. Anna dies. This whole brood of a family is dependent on him. He's in his 60s. And he fell apart. He went off to Maine for about 2 months, actually to Poland Springs, Maine, where we get all these water bottles now. And they had a resort up there. And I had one letter that indicated he may have stayed in a farmhouse, another that he might have stayed in this resort hotel. I don't know. But he just stays up there by himself. Happily, he did write some letters to his daughter, which are precious, about what all this meant. And at times he let his hair down, especially in letters to that, again, his oldest daughter. Which was a tender, but sometimes difficult relationship, fathers and daughters. And he let his hair down with her at times, and no doubt in person he must have as well. So this was a man of enormous stress and pressure, fighting the odds of history. At the same time, he's trying to make ends meet in a deeply racist society that didn't even want to believe he existed. We should never expect him to just be that perfect manly figure in all those photographs.
No, he was the struggling patriarch, at least in his family.
Right.
And struggling with patriarchy. I mean, you make it clear he, is a women's rights supporter, even as he finds himself maybe needing to compromise on that issue. Later
over the 15th Amendment, he surely did.
Yeah.
Got into a big fight, but.
Yeah. Well, I want to get in maybe a little bit more into his politics because,
Sure.
The elephant in the room, we're sitting here on November 5th. We're still counting votes.
I know. It will be for at least 2 or 3 more days, apparently.
It's going to take a while. And, living at a time when, before the election, a lot of urging to get out and vote. Now the mantra is count the votes. We're living at a time of voter suppression. And to think about Frederick Douglass in this context is quite interesting because he had a lot to say about the power of the vote and what the vote
all
meant
the
to
time.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the phrases that jumped out at me, he says the vote was the keystone to the arch of human liberty.
Right.
So what did the vote mean to him? I know that's a big question, but as we stop and think about it today, it'd be interesting to hear what he had to say.
Well, that's a beautiful metaphor you chose there, but he had many other metaphors as well for the vote, the right to vote. Right after the Civil War in 1866, in another context, again, he's arguing that the right to vote is the most sacred right. It's the most important right. It will protect all the other rights. And at times there were people who said, you're going a little too far with this, Frederick. And maybe he did. Maybe he put too much emphasis on it. But at one point there in 66, he called the vote the wall of fire. He said it was the wall of fire around all of your other rights. It would protect you. He was always using that term protection. The right to vote protects you. And sometimes he would convert it into this idea that we don't vote as individuals. We're not just alone by ourselves voting. We're voting as part of, groups and constituencies and persuasions. And sometimes we're part of, everyone should think about themselves. I mean, we may be part of 8 different groups and constituencies, and they depend on us. Douglass argued this. He said, you don't just vote as an individual. Your people depend on you to vote. It isn't just about you. Yes, it's one person, one vote and all that, but no, it isn't. It's all get to vote. Anyway, but he put so much stress on the vote, even during the war, when, you could begin to see the possibilities here of emancipation and then constitutional amendment of the 13th. I mean, the 13th Amendment, people should know, the amendment that ends slavery was being debated as early as 1863. It's debated all through the 1864 election year. It's one of the things the Democrats pilloried the Republicans with. These Republicans, don't elect them. I mean, it's classic wedge politics. Don't elect them. They'll do a constitutional amendment to end slavery. My God. Oh, well, they were right. They did. Anyway, Douglass put so much weight on the vote. And many of us historian critics ever since have suggested maybe he went too far with this. Maybe he was too much of a classic political liberal, that he saw all solutions as political, that he didn't analyze material life and economic change enough. There's actually a lot of merit to that. But you can't get around the fact that he saw the vote as the centerpiece of the product of the natural rights tradition. At the end of the day, and now there are, oh God, there are whole rooms full of political theorists working on Douglass, and they all come around in one way or another to this idea of how committed he was to the Enlightenment ideal of natural rights, which are all there in the 4 first principles of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Douglass loved the Declaration of Independence, by the way. He loved the principles. He hated the practices at times. But he saw the vote as the ultimate, result of this ancient tradition of natural rights before God or before nature. And he even argued, by the 1880s, he was arguing for mandatory voting. You hear that now and then now. He argued that you ought to be taxed if you don't vote. Yeah. And you know what? Hey, why not?
He clearly, and it comes out very clearly in your book, and it's a striking thing about him, is he had a lot of faith in American democracy and American institutions. I mean, you mentioned the Declaration, the Constitution, of course. He didn't take the interpretation of some of his peers, some of the abolitionist peers like Garrison, who saw it as a very pro-slavery document. He saw more possibility in it.
He did. That's very important, because in some ways he was more forward seeing or looking than many of the other radical abolitionists. He could see that it was essential to imagine an anti-slavery political coalition if you were ever going to end slavery in America. Slavery was ultimately about the core of its power. And that power was economic, but that power was also its stranglehold on the institutions of government. And that's why he was both thrilled, but also always troubled by the evolution of the Republican Party in the 1850s, because he could never quite convince himself these people were ever going to be radical enough to truly end slavery. Yeah, they might stop its expansion. They might indeed be against the Fugitive Slave Act. Yeah, they hated the Dred Scott case, but he couldn't quite figure out how to totally shoulder up to them. But as he said in as late as the 1860 election, he was very glad, in speaking of Lincoln, to see an anti-slavery tendency elected. A tendency. So, in fact, Douglass makes a great political story in part because it is the evolution of a kind of radical pragmatist.
Yeah.
You know, he has to learn the craft of politics. By that, I don't mean just electoral politics, but how you understand legislatures and the art of political argument and political persuasion. And it's a great part of his story. Ever since graduate school, because that was a big part of my first book, I've been drawn to this. He's just a classic study of the radical outsider who finds ways to at least get a toehold inside of political power without ever running for office.
But and that's kind of the arc of your book, as you say at the outset, from the radical outsider to political insider. And we see that, but by the end of the book, I was really taken by the last chapter or so when he meets up with Ida B. Wells, T. Washington. It's now the early 1890s. We've seen a resurgence of white supremacist politics. It's incredibly violent, lynching all around him.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I appreciated the chapter. I felt like the baton was being passed to the next generation of Black leaders. But there's also, he's grappling with, a different United States.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's how it seems. And I wondered if some of his, to what extent was he becoming disillusioned? And some of that faith in American systems, was it starting to erode?
Yeah.
How did he end his life?
Yeah, and there were times when he kind of keeps hope against hope. Keeps hope alive by, however he can. He would often, in the latter part of his life, end speeches, or somewhere in a speech, you'd see that line out of Matthew, or there's other places in the Bible. I walk by faith and not by sight. I don't operate by what I see. I operate by what I believe. We may have all faced that before. Yes, he begins to lose some faith, clearly, in the Republican Party as it changed. It changed drastically by the 1880s into a party of, big business and high tariffs. And Douglass was at times disgusted, but yet he had no other place to go politically, as he famously said. The Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea. There was no other political place to go. He also gets into terrible rivalries. This, to me, again, the Evans collection was so important on this because it revealed so much of this on the granular level. He had some terrible rivalries with the next generation of male Black leadership. Richard T. Greener, the first Black graduate of Harvard, John Mercer Langston, the Oberlin graduate, congressman, ambassador, and so on and so forth. These guys were all at least 20 years younger than Douglass. They were freeborn, they were college educated. And here's the great Douglass, this former slave, who everybody calls, the leader of his race. Well, they wanted to knock him off. And sometimes they just had real fights over strategies and ideology and politics. But it turns out this sometimes brought out not his best qualities. He liked being on the pedestal.
Yeah.
He liked being king of the hill. And he often threw the mud back at them worse than they threw it at him. So there's that. But yes, the young, very young Ida Wells had quite an influence on it. Actually, they had mutual influence. He was almost like a grandfather figure to her. When they met, he helped her arrange her whole tour of England and so on and so forth. He helped her with some of her writing. And then they, of course, collaborated at Chicago at the Great World's Fair there. And it was partly through that connection that he began to think and write so much about lynching. And the last great speech of his life, Lessons of the Hour, he crafted in 1893 he crafted it first while he was in Chicago for 6-7 months as the representative of the nation of Haiti, not of the United States. And that speech, he honed over a period of months into yet another masterpiece. That speech is a good place to look to understand the question you asked.
Mm-hmm.
How did he manage to keep alive this commitment in the face of a society now using terror and violence and disfranchisement and trying to literally turn around almost every element of the victories of the Civil War, which had come in the middle of his life. And now in the twilight of his life, he sees not just betrayed, but all but defeated. And in that speech, he gave a brilliant kind of three-part analysis of why lynching was happening, which still holds up quite well.
Mm-hmm.
But even at the end of that speech, he draws back to the natural rights tradition. And he says, but still, nothing can kill our natural right to equality before God, our natural right to the right to vote, to political liberty. No matter what you do to these rights, you cannot crush them. So you can read that speech as two different speeches. The one that is this poignant analysis of lynching, and the other that is just a kind of a keep hope alive message. But I do think Douglass always had that, or felt that burden, and it's one of the reasons he kept writing autobiography. I think he did feel that sense of responsibility to give hope to this project of American multi-ethnicity, of American, expansion of liberty, expansion of the idea of equality. He really did believe the idea of America was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
The question was making it work.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the lessons here for this moment, frankly, because I keep getting asked about it, but I find one of the lessons
thinking about as you're saying this right now.
Well, one of the lessons we can take from Douglass, if we read him even with a little bit of care, is that the story's never over. He had to have a long view of history. And just look at it. He lives the whole trajectory of the 19th century. He's born in 1818 before the railroad, the telegraph, steamships, and everything, the rotary press, and all these things. But he lives all the way to electric light bulbs, telephones, and recording devices, and steamships across the Atlantic in 7 to 8 days, and on and on and on. And yet, he lived this story of slavery, racism, emancipation, and then its overthrow. And he didn't give up. Nobody, you can't give up. And he saw white supremacy emerge, reemerge, be defeated, reemerge, be defeated.
Forms.
You take all, mutate, which it always does, right?
It always does.
It always mutates into a new form, a new kind of politics, a new subtlety.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, I don't think, ever surprised by that. He might be shocked by individual events. But it was a burden too, because he felt this responsibility of hope. And that's a tough thing when 250 people a year are being lynched. And he goes to the Deep South later in his life. He went all the way to Florida on one trip. He did Georgia, Alabama, where he did commencement speech in 1892 at Tuskegee for Booker T. Washington, which is a fascinating story. Because Booker T complains in private letters, this Douglass, he wants too much money. He brings a handler with him, and he was an old man. He had his grandson-in-law traveling with him, and Booker T thought that cost too much. But it's kind of classic Booker T. Washington, but also classic Douglass. He was demanding things of people. But he went there. He went to Tuskegee Institute of all places and gave his self-made man speech. So, it's not like he didn't understand the South by then. But he's this, and he always has to be. This was a burden too. He always had to be this symbol. Yeah, the former slave who became such a special figure. And that too was not an easy thing to constantly live with. He had a real problem with fame, its pleasures and its perils.
Not an easy thing to live with. And if we had more time, I'd delve into it a little bit more with you about how, as his biographer, you deal with the way that his symbol is used today. Talk about how it's manipulated. But if we were in person at the festival, this would be the time for me to open questions up to the audience and let them raise their hands. And in this Zoom world, we found a way to kind of replicate that. And we do have some questions from people who wrote in advance. And I'm just going to go through a few of them for you. The first one is about your research. And what was the most surprising or unexpected thing you discovered about Douglass? So clearly you knew Douglass pretty well before you really sat down to work on this book. So what surprised you?
Well, I think most of my work before on Douglass had been largely about his ideas, his intellectual life. I mean, I had taken some deep dives into his biography, but I had never committed to be the full biographer. One of the surprises was his hypersensitivity to slights. Now we might just say, that's a human trait, but slights about race or slights about his lack of education. And when he sensed either one of those, you could have a dragon on your hands. And there are many instances of this, kind of famous instances of him just reacting with a rage that would come out of him. I was also, I think, less specifically, but more generally surprised at some of the depth of difficulty and struggle and his own role in making it of his private life. He had a 22 or so year relationship with a German woman named Ottilia Assing. Ottilia floats in and out of my book for many, many chapters. As she tried to float in and out of Douglass's life through many, many years. And, but that's both an enigma in part, because it's hard to get at it, since Douglass left us nothing about it, and all that we know about it comes from Ottilia Assing. But there's also his role in it that eventually became a very difficult thing for me to explain. And it surprised me to a degree, the depth of which he hid this. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I think I was. There are other things too, but
you got to wonder what he would think about how you found it and wrote about it.
Well, you know, every biographer, I wonder if this has happened to you too with some of your subject, especially the biography, because you live with these people for years. Every biographer wishes he or she could get the subject in a room, bring them back, have like a 5-hour seminar and just have at it. And I actually have a list on paper of all because I've been asked this so many times, of all these questions I would ask Douglass if I could get him in a room. Of course, he slithers out of those questions every time you try, but I got a lot of them. Yeah. My first question, by the way, would be, Mr. Douglass, Anna, discuss.
Yes.
And you can't leave until you do.
And we would all appreciate that.
I know, but he won't do it. He just won't do it.
Another question, we've managed to talk for a long time here, quite a while, and about the middle of the 19th century and the Civil War era, and we haven't talked about Lincoln. And one of our audience members has asked, how many times did Douglass meet with Lincoln, and what was their most significant discussion?
Well, they met 3 times. August of 1863, the White House. At Douglass's insistence, he just went there and got in line. August of 1864, at Lincoln's invitation, which is very important, and they had their most important and lengthy discussion, which I can explain. And then thirdly, they met at the second inaugural, or right after the second inaugural, at the White House. Douglass attended the second inaugural. He stood down in the crowd off to Lincoln's left. And after that great speech, Douglass got in line on Pennsylvania Avenue and followed the presidential carriage back to the White House. Again, he had no invitation. but he just got in line. And when he got to the door, the guards said, no, 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 sir, you can't enter. And he put a card through. He said, tell the president Frederick Douglass is here. And quickly the news came back, come on in. And they had an extraordinary encounter, apparently in the East Room, about the speech, which Douglass describes for us later, although we do have at least one other eyewitness account of that. The meetings were important, but there are only 3 of them. However, the relationship in rhetoric, especially from Douglass, is rich. And, at the outset of the war, Douglass was a ferocious critic of Lincoln because, the Lincoln administration through the first year of the war, again, you know this story very well from studying Emancipation and Refugees and so on. The Lincoln administration policy was to try to return fugitive slaves to their owners. At one point, Douglass called Lincoln in an editorial the most powerful slave catcher in the land. He was a bitter critic of Lincoln's way into the summer of 1862, until Lincoln issued that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September, and then particularly after the final proclamation in January, whereupon Douglass really changed his tune, because obviously the purpose of the war changed significantly. And it's part of what prompted the first meeting between them in August of 63. Although what really prompted that first meeting is that Douglass at that point had decided to stop recruiting Black soldiers. And he literally took a train to Washington, the first time he'd ever set foot in Washington, D.C., and demanded to confront the president about all the discriminations against Black soldiers. They had what today, in diplomacy, they would call a good exchange of views, but they didn't agree, at least at that point. The following year, though, was very different because Lincoln was standing for re-election. His prospects of his re-election were really rather dire. It was battlefield victories that sort of saved Lincoln's re-election in many ways. He called Frederick Douglass to the White House in August of 64 and asked this most important Black leader in the country to help set up a scheme of funneling as many slaves as possible out of the upper South into Union lines and freedom before Election Day in case he lost the election, because the fear was the Democrats under McClellan would probably make a negotiated peace. And emancipation would be off. And frankly, Douglass was stunned. First of all, that Lincoln was asking him to do this. And 2, how in hell was he going to do it? Again, Douglass got saved there too by the victories on the front in the war. And that fall, this gets so rich, and I'll be quiet. But that fall, Douglass wanted to campaign for Lincoln vigorously, and the Republican Party wouldn't let him, because again, the wedge issue of that campaign was the Democrats tarring the Republicans as the party of emancipation. And the last thing they wanted was this most famous Black man up there speaking for Lincoln. But it didn't stop Lincoln from going to speak to Black folk and advocating Lincoln's reelection. And I do think it's one of the major turning points in not just in that relationship, but in Douglass's own view of the government, of the Lincoln administration, and even of the meaning of the war. It's a fascinating connection the two of them have. We sometimes, some have tried to make a little more of it, trying to argue that Douglass had this tremendous influence on Lincoln. That's hard to find direct evidence for. But here's one last fact we know. After the second inaugural, I think within about 2 weeks, Lincoln invited Douglass to come to the soldiers' home in Washington. This was the sort of retreat, about 25-minute carriage ride from the White House, where Lincoln would go for tea. An invitation to come to tea, which would have been obviously a longer meeting, a more informal meeting. But that meeting never happened because Douglass was on the road. He had a speaking engagement. He couldn't go. And then, of course, 2 weeks later came the assassination. And Douglass always regretted somehow that he
Mm,
hadn't taken that invitation. Um,
I bet. Well, David,
he
we
will also invent about 3 different kinds of Abraham Lincolns over time as in different kinds of eulogies of. He did what we all do with Lincoln. He
yeah.
appropriated the Lincoln he needed for a given moment.
Well, we have actually hit the end of our hour here. There's so much more that I could ask you. I mean, it's such a rich biography. I strongly encourage everybody out there to get their hands on a copy. It is a page turner. And even though I went into it thinking I knew a lot about Douglass already, but there was so much more to learn. You think about Douglass in relationship to other looming figures of the 19th century. Here in Lexington, there's nobody more revered than Henry Clay.
Well,
Would it be correct to say Frederick Douglass not a fan of Henry Clay?
no, not a fan. In fact, he explicitly used Clay early on in the 40s, late 40s, as a target to go after the Whig side of what Douglass considered the slave power. He particularly attacked Clay's colonizationism. Very directly, very explicitly in editorials as well as speeches. He did the same thing with John C. Calhoun, by the way. At times, Douglass even referred to the entire South as Calhoundom. I don't know of an instance where he called it Claydom, but no, he Clay was a huge national figure, and it was like you just named Henry Clay, and everybody knew what you were talking about, a certain point of view. But he did with Clay what Douglass tended to do by this political stage of his life. He used political figures as targets, as foils to make his arguments.
And how, as you say, what would we give to put Clay and Douglass in a room together and hear them?
I bet they'd have one heck of a conversation. It might get a little testy, to say the least. But it would be interesting because Clay has all that early background and sort of colonizationist, anti-slavery, and so on and so forth. Tremendous influence on Lincoln, of course, and ultimately Clay is a sort of a forerunner of the Republican Party. If you or I were the moderator of that, I think that's where I'd try to start, just to make the thing civil, and then we'd see where we'd go, right?
Right. Well, we're left to our imaginations, I suppose. So, but again, it's been great talking with you, and thank you for writing this book. I mean, this is it's a really important book for us to have, and thank you for being with us in Kentucky today.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thanks to everybody who organizes the Kentucky Book Festival, and thank you for your book, the best book yet we have about the entire Emancipation refugee crisis of the Civil War. It's the place to start on that.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thanks to Professors Blight and Taylor for sharing their talent and insights with us today. And to the University of Kentucky Department of History, we appreciate your support. We also want to thank you for joining us for this 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online event. If you're interested in purchasing one of the books discussed today, please visit our independent bookstore partner, Joseph Beth Booksellers, at josephbeth.com. For a complete schedule of Kentucky Book Festival conversations, visit kyhumanities.org and follow us on social media at KY Humanities. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Bill Goodman.